Austin, in that election, Austin faces not only Houston, but another political figure from Texas named Henry Smith, who had been the provisional governor during the early phase of the revolution. And Austin actually finishes a distant third. He had really fallen out of popularity with his fellow Texans, something that greatly grieved him, mainly because they thought he had been too pro-Mexican for too long, and that he had not, of course, during the heat of the action, Battle of the Alamo, Battle of San Jacinto, the whole campaign, the San Jacinto campaign, he had been whining and dining it in the United States instead of being out with the troops. But Sam Houston understood that Austin was still, in many ways, the most valuable citizen of the new republic. And at Houston's request, Austin accepted the position of Secretary of State for the new republic. Austin made annexation to the United States his number one priority as Secretary of State, but he didn't live to see really even the first movement in that direction, because after only a couple of months in office in December 1836, he comes down with pneumonia and dies at the age of 43. Sam Houston himself published the funeral announcement in which he said, "We perform a most painful duty in announcing the death of General Stephen F. Austin, who departed this life yesterday. The patriarch has left us." And so really, even though many people think Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin were somehow enemies, really it was Sam Houston who first really applied the label the father of Texas to Stephen F. Austin. I think that's worth remembering. How do we make sense of the life and legacy of Stephen F. Austin? Well, the first serious Austin scholar was the great University of Texas historian and professor Eugene C. Barker, who joined the faculty of the University of Texas in 1900. Barker was part of that first generation of trained American historians, university-trained historians with PhDs in history. And he wasn't sure what he exactly wanted to do with his life, but early in his time at the University of Texas, he discovered that the Austin family, Austin didn't have any descendants, of course, because he never married, but he discovered that the Austin descendants, his sister's actual descendants, still had some 4,000 pages of Austin's letters and papers, and they donated those papers eventually to the University of Texas. Barker now had this treasure trove of documents involving the Austin family and really the history of that whole period of Texas history. And he spent several years editing a big 4-volume set of Austin's papers, which were subsequently published by the American Historical Association, and then 1 volume by the University of Texas. Having done this editing project for several years, in the early 1920s, Austin finally decided, well, no one has used these papers to write a biography of Austin, so I guess it falls to me. And he wrote what is considered one of the great classics of Texas historical literature, his book, The Life of Stephen F. Austin, founder of Texas, a chapter in the westward movement of the Anglo-American people. Now, that subtitle tells you something about where Barker was coming from. He viewed Austin's life as a vehicle for telling the story of the westward movement of the American people. It was really a sort of dressed up scholarly version of the old idea of manifest destiny. And Barker made it very clear what kind of biography he wanted to write. He said in his introduction to his 1925 biography, "The character of this treatment is primarily factual and direct rather than interpretive. It is in what he did and the manner of doing it that the admirable character and winning personality of the man must appear." So the Austin that emerges from Barker's pages is the heroic, modest, self-sacrificing father of Texas, who sacrificed his all so that Texas might arise. This was not unexpected. This was a great era of what we might call the great man biography, right? You wrote biographies of great men to show people the example of greatness in action. What we didn't find in Barker's work really was almost anything about the personality of Austin, about the character of the man, and heaven forbid any potential quirks or flaws or idiosyncrasies that he might have had. We found out almost nothing about his motives, really about what made him tick. Yet there were tantalizing clues throughout Austin's papers. For example, when he was about 11 years old and in that proper New England boarding school, his father had written him this letter. I hope and pray you will use every moment of your time to the utmost advantage, and that I shall have the satisfaction of seeing that my expectations are not disappointed. Remember, my dear son, that the present is the moment to lay the foundation for your future greatness in life. Wow. He went on to tell us, Stephen, about how much money was being expended on his education, corrected his handwriting. He finally closed the letter by saying, I hope to God I shall be spared until I see you arrive at an age to give protection to your dear mother and sister and little brother Brown. Remember that to you they will look for protection, should it so happen that my life should be shortened. Keep in mind this may happen. Well, this is a heavy load to lay on an 11-year-old, right? That the hopes, all the future hopes of one of America's great families rest on your skinny 11-year-old shoulders. Even by 19th century standards, that's pretty heavy stuff. Fast forward to Austin's 21st birthday. He's in New Orleans, in St. Louis. He'd been there for a meeting of the territorial legislature. And he writes this letter to his brother-in-law. This is after the family fortune has come crashing down. Moses is broke. He's broke. He says, when the day arrives that the whole family are out of debt, I mean to celebrate it as my wedding day, which will never come until then. Wow. What kind of a 20-something-year-old man makes a vow to never marry until the day that his family is out of debt? You start putting these clues together and you begin to see a young man who is carrying a really heavy load, right, inside him. And these are the sort of things that help a modern biographer start to try to unlock some of the keys to Austin's personality. When he arrives when he gets settled in Texas and devotes himself so single-mindedly to his colonization venture, and it becomes almost an obsession with him, you can almost understand it better once you understand the pressures that he's lived with all of his life, the expectations, and the notion about family greatness. Near the end of his life, Austin had the opportunity to reflect on how he had spent his life. And he wrote this to his brother-in-law, James Perry. Instead of roaming about in other countries to speculate, I have devoted my life to the arduous task of trying to redeem this country from the wilderness, and I've succeeded greatly beyond what I supposed was possible, for I was ridiculed by some for attempting such a thing. I had no capital, and I've supplied its defect by personal labor and attention and putting my shoulder to the wheel in earnest and good faith. I have not made a fortune for myself, and probably shall not live to derive much personal benefit, but I have greatly benefited many others, hundreds of them, and have made them and their families rich, who were worth nothing before, and I have opened and enlarged a fine field for human enterprise and human happiness. This has always been the main object of my ambition, and not a mere avaricious view to personal speculation. So the modern biographer of Austin, freed from the constraints of great man history like Eugene Barker, might well conclude that Stephen F. Austin was a complicated figure, no doubt, but he was also a figure that probably most of us in some ways are familiar with, the driven personality type, the obsessive workaholic, but also the man who who needed a higher calling in life. Some people are content to have a job. Some people need to have a mission. And he only really found himself when the Texas project landed in his lap after his father's death. And he was able to now see his life's work laid out ahead of him. He could see the mission that became his life. And of course, that mission was the settlement of Texas. Now, a future Austin biographer will probably reach other conclusions, and that's the way it should be. A generation from now, when some enterprising Austin biographer comes along, we may be asking a whole new set of questions. But of course, that's the way history works. And now we're happy to take your questions. Please submit them to the chat room.